who is here. We will post a link to the executive summary in the chat for you. If you haven't already downloaded both summaries, they are in the calendar invite right above where you sign it, or right below where you sign in if you need to get those. But we also are posting them here in the chat and will throughout so that everyone can get them. And I'll turn this over to Judge Scorsone.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. My name is Ernesto Scorsone. I'm one of the circuit judges here in Fayette County. I am pleased to be here along with Fayette District Judge Melissa Moore Murphy to co-chair this panel, this distinguished panel, on the issue. It's basically a discussion about the results of a survey that was done of the bench and bar dealing with attitudes as they relate to race, gender, sexual orientation, and identity. Just a little background, how we got to this place, and that is that the LGBT section of the Kentucky Bar Association was the one that initiated this survey. Those of us who are members of that section, we can all share stories, anecdotes about incidents where we felt that LGBT issues caused either an issue of harassment, discrimination, or some ill treatment in the legal system, whether it be at the hands of a judge, prosecutor, opposing counsel, what have you. We wanted to know really what was a kind of a scientific view of our legal system. Do we have a problem? And if so, where? So we decided that we wanted to have a professional survey done of the bench and bar to check out what the attitudes are, whether there is a problem or not, whether these anecdotes that we would hear about were representative of what was really going on around the state. So we pushed for that, and we work with the diversity committee of the bar, and our hats off is to Professor Allison Connolly, co-chair of that diversity committee, that worked with us hand in glove to make this a reality. Then we were able to get a fund, education fund, from Just Fund Kentucky to be able to acquire the services of a fine researcher from the University of Kentucky. And that's how we got this survey done at the end of last year. We were going to have this CLE program early this year. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit us and we weren't able to do that. But let me just say that this is the first CLE discussion of the survey, but there will be other instances and other CLE presentations. We are working on an article for the bench and bar, and I know the judges have already incorporated this survey as part of their judicial college that was originally scheduled for October, but now it's going to be put off till next year. So there will be more discussion. But to start out today's webinar, we were lucky to be able to get Dr. Melanie Otis, who is the researcher that really put together the survey, helped carry it out, and helped us analyze the results, to be here with us. Dr. Otis is a Brautigam Professor of Criminal, Juvenile, and Social Justice at the UK College of Social Work. We are indebted to her for her fine work in putting together the survey, and we're indebted to her for being here today to discuss this matter with us. So, Dr. Otis.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I apologize in advance for any sound issues you might have. And I'll also say, in the interest of brevity here, make sure I don't wander off, because I'm more of a ad-lib improvisational kind of speaker. I have it written down, and so there'll be some reading involved. Okay, so I'll just, and I'll tell you, you have access to both the executive summary and the full survey, so you know there's a lot in there. There's a whole lot in there, and you can slice out any area that you want to around diversity issues and drill down into that and do a lot with it. And so I am truly just going to hit some highlights that'll become maybe launch points for discussion from the survey. So just start off, so Judge Scorsone gave sort of the background on KBA, so I'll just jump into sort of the process we use methodologically. So once we had this discussion, my process on the front end was to go into the literature and see where the American Bar Association and other state bar associations stood in terms of examining issues of diversity around the country. And part of that was to kind of see what the findings were as current as they could be. And part of that was to look for possible instruments, measures to use, so we might have some comparative data for whatever we found in Kentucky. Sort of a couple things I'll say about that. One is that there's not a lot of research done on anything other than primarily gender bias. That's been a real focal point with the ABA. Somewhat less, but still kind of central around race, ethnicity. And after that, while there are questions that I found that were related to other areas, they weren't very prominent. Nevertheless, when I could, I used measures that had already been used other places and adjusted the wording to fit for Kentucky. So what we did, and I'll kind of go to my notes now, potential study participants were recruited through an email that was sent out to all KBA members that had a valid email address in the KBA listserv. So that kind of, you all who are members of that can kind of wrap your brain around how good or not so good that might be as a method, but that's what we used. The president of the KBA sent out an email to everybody announcing the study, giving people some background information on it, letting folks know it was voluntary and all those things, and providing a link to the survey. So given that methodology, what we have is data that represents self-selected participants, and you want to keep that in mind. We're not saying that this data means any more or less than what it can based on the people who decided to participate in the study. The drafts of the survey were reviewed by members of the KBA Diversity Committee. They provided feedback, and we made adjustments based on that. And the data was actually collected between September of 2018 and December of 2018, and then analyzed in the months that followed that. 2,015 people went to the online survey website and at least opened the survey. Out of that, we had 203 responses that couldn't be used because there was just insufficient data to analyze across any of the areas that we were covering. And so we ended up with 1,812 Kentucky Bar Association members that answered questions in areas related to gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation identity, and gender identity. And we also had some questions about immigration and disability and some other areas that I won't talk about today. Of the final sample, and you can kind of think of this as reflective in large part of what we know about Kentucky. So the final sample, the majority of respondents were male. That was 60.7% of the overall sample was male. It was white, heterosexual, and cisgender with an average age of 49.7 years. The majority of the participants were attorneys, again, reflective of what we might expect. And so 95.7% were attorneys, the rest were identified as judges practicing in civil law. And about 60% of the overall sample was split evenly between saying they practiced primarily either in Louisville or in central Kentucky, which would be inclusive of Lexington, Fayette County. So we went in to do the analysis where, as much as possible, did comparisons based on the respondents' gender, race, ethnicity, and then when we could, we looked at geographic location, sexual orientation identity, and gender identity, and judicial roles, so comparing attorneys and judges on their responses. So what I'm going to do is just highlight, just briefly, a few items in the three core areas that we examined, starting off looking at observations of bias related to defendants, litigants, witnesses, victims related to race, ethnicity bias. So first off, and this was true across the other areas, the vast majority of people, when they were asked, of respondents, when they were asked about whether or not they thought people were treated with courtesy and respect, regardless of race, ethnicity, most people said yes. Now, by majority, what we're saying is at least 50% of people said yes to that, okay? But there was still a substantial number of people who said no, that was not the case, that they did see bias related to race, ethnicity in various settings. So, and we went in and asked and I'm not going to get into this here, but you can see it in the executive summary. We drilled down and said, okay, tell us, did you see bias with judges? Did you see bias with defense attorneys? Did you see bias with prosecutors, court clerks? And we had differences in responses. And I'll tell you that across all the things that we looked at, prosecutors fared the least well. They were most often seen to be biased regardless of the areas that we were talking about. Females and people of color were significantly more likely to disagree with the statement that people were treated with courtesy and respect regardless of race, ethnicity. And you're going to see a theme here that I'll talk about later on. When asked about sentencing decisions, about 40% believed that minority defendants would receive a more severe sentence than a non-minority defendant. So approximately 40% of folks thought, you know, if it's a person who's a minority, they're probably going to get a more severe sentence. Very few people said that they thought that they would get a less severe sentence, and the balance said they didn't think it was going to make any difference. In terms of gender bias, the majority felt, again, that Kentucky courtesy and respect regardless of gender. Now, having said that, females, people of color, LGBTQ persons were significantly more likely to disagree with that statement. They were significantly more likely to say that they had seen gender bias occur. Judges were more likely to agree with the statement than attorneys. So judges were likely to think to feel that people were treated regardless of gender than attorneys were. And approximately 1/3 of all the respondents indicated that they had experienced or observed some kind of unfair treatment related to gender within the court setting, with females, again, being more likely to say that they'd witnessed those things occurring. In terms of sexual identity and orientation and gender identity, and this is a really interesting difference here, less than half of all the female respondents agreed that people were treated with courtesy and respect, regardless of sexual identity or orientation, while 74% of males believed that was true. There's a 30% difference here in the perception of what goes on related to sexual orientation, gender identity. And this perception piece is a huge part of what you see threaded throughout the data. Very similarly, approximately 40% of females compared to 71% of males believed that people were treated with respect in terms of gender identity. Again, it's probably one of the largest discrepancies in perception that we saw in the data was around these things. And about a quarter of female respondents, compared to only 10% of male respondents, indicated that they had seen or experienced unfair treatment of people in Kentucky courts based on their sexual identity or orientation. So there's this, whether it's perception or we can argue about what facts are, there's a real difference in what people are observing. So that's what I want to highlight about what they've observed in terms of court users, and I'll just briefly talk about some of the findings related to respondents' personal experience, how you're experiencing being an attorney or judge in Kentucky. Specifically, we asked everybody a question, said, do you believe you have been discriminated against as a member of the legal profession? And 34.4% of all respondents said yes. Then we followed that up with each one of the areas that we'd examined and said, do you believe it was because of? And so we asked about race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, identity. And so as we went through, the primary thing that people mentioned was that 40% of the respondents indicated that they believed they'd been discriminated, 34%, let me find that, because they were female, because of gender. That's because of gender, and that's roughly the same number that is represented in terms of women in the survey. And that's part of what you see, while the numbers are lower in other areas, it corresponds with the number of people in that group in the actual survey. So when we ask about other areas, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, we have less than 10% of respondents that said, yes, I believe I was discriminated against because of those things. And while these numbers are small, it should be noted that in each case, it largely aligns with the representation of that group in the data. In other words, most people who identified with one of those groups that they were asked about said, yeah, I've experienced discrimination at some time related to the fact that I am a person of color, that I identify as or was presumed to be LGBTQ. And so we have sort of a universal problem, even if when you first look at it, it seems like it's a very small number of people. One of the primary areas, and again, I was trying to kind of look at things where you could see what's going on in other places in the country. So I mentioned that the American Bar Association, one of the primary areas that every year they collect data around are things related to gender discrimination. And so I'll just highlight some of the, and these were questions when they were put in the survey that came straight from the ABA survey in order to kind of look at Kentucky in relation to that. And so we're asking about questions related to gender. 1/3 of respondents said that they had personally experienced unfair treatment based on gender in court. And 57.8% said that they witnessed unfair treatment in other professional settings. So outside court might be in your law office or in some other setting other than the courtroom. Females, 48.7% compared to 4.4% of males, were more likely to indicate that they had been assumed to be a court clerk. And so there's your tell there. Huge difference. Females were significantly less likely to believe that female attorneys and judges would have the same opportunities as male attorneys and judges, or that they were equally likely to serve as lead counsel, which is one of the measures the ABA uses as an indication of equity, right? And so it's helpful even if we don't have a necessarily representative sample to see how this data aligns with the national data. Female respondents were also more likely to report all forms of sexual harassment. So we asked about a variety of things and they were more likely to report that. However, the majority indicated that they did not report that sexual harassment to anyone. And when asked why they didn't report, the vast majority said because of fear of retaliation. And when we asked in other areas and people talked about experiencing discrimination in other areas, the primary reason they gave for not reporting it to anybody was for fear of retaliation. Again, a very important piece of information, given that sometimes the argument for not doing something about a problem is saying there's no documentation the problem exists. And so we're on a slippery slope there. In addition to those gender-focused questions, we had 40% of respondents of color that indicated that they'd experienced discrimination based on their race. And of LGBTQ identified respondents, they were more likely to believe that someone's sexual identity, orientation, or gender identity would result in them experiencing some form of discrimination within the legal system and the courtroom setting. And again, as a result, they opted, if they could, not to have their LGBTQ identity known. And there again, so we can not do anything about a problem that's not identified. So I'll close with sort of an overarching thread when you go through all the data that you see, is that when we look at respondents who identified as members of groups, so women, and we were asking questions about gender, people who identified as LGBTQ, we're asking questions about sexual identity, gender identity, that they were going to be more likely to say, yes, I've seen that. I've seen it happen to clients in the courtroom or other people in the courtroom. I've experienced it myself, than people who are outside that group. And that's, again, it's a very important thing to kind of keep in mind that as a member of the group, you're aware of things, not just your own experience, but what you see happen to other people. And so you're attending to those things in a very different way than people who don't already identify with that group. And so I'm going to close with one other piece. We asked them, I say there's tons of things in this survey, but one of the things we asked people about was whatever continuing ed activities, programming they'd had in the last 5 years. And we were trying to get at how prepared people felt they were to work with different client populations and things like that. And so the majority of folks said, yeah, I've attended programming related to gender bias and racial ethnic bias. That was the most common thing. And about 40% said they'd attended some kind of programming that was related to sexual identity or gender identity. So people were getting continuing education activities and programming around these areas. People of color, interestingly enough, were more likely to say that they had attended programs related to racial and ethnic bias. And they were also more likely to say they'd attended something that was related to gender identity bias. For those who had attended these programs and experienced this, about a half of them said that the experience had positively affected their behavior, that they learned something, they gained something, they felt some insight, and they changed the way they were approaching things and thinking about things. Females were much more likely, significantly more likely, and everything I've talked about, these are significant, statistically significant differences, to say that it affected their behavior in some way, that as the result of participating in this programming, that it led them to make some changes and think about things in a different way. More than half of the male participants in the study said the programming, whatever they experienced, impacted them in no way. Didn't change what they were doing, didn't change how they were thinking. I will stop with that, I'm happy to expand on that if you like, but I'll stop with that as kind of a laying some groundwork, and we can come back to any of that or something else later on.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Otis. Let me remind participants that on the Q&A, if you've got a particular question, type it in there for us. We'll be glad to address it to whoever you'd like the question addressed to. And now, Judge Murphy, if you don't mind introducing the rest of the panel.
I sure can. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with Julie Butcher. So Julie was born in Michigan. She came to Kentucky by way of Virginia for her undergraduate degree in theater arts at UK. When she realized she would have to leave Kentucky to earn a living in theater, she followed her mother's advice and applied to UK law. Before, during, and after law school, she worked at an insurance defense firm, Langdon in Lexington. In 1994, Julie had a trial against Gary C. Johnson in Pikeville, and afterwards, Gary asked her to open his Lexington satellite office. 8 years later, Julie opened her own personal injury law office in Lexington. Over the years, she's been privileged to represent many wonderful clients through some of the most difficult times in their lives. Currently, Julie describes herself as a recovering lawyer as she winds down her 30 years of practice and begins spending more time painting and volunteering for Casa of Lexington, Habitat for Humanity, and God's Pantry. Julie and her spouse, Allison Conley, most of us know as Professor C, recently celebrated 30 years together, the last 12 years married. Fortunately, COVID has not changed their love for one another. Thank you for being with us, Julie. Next, and I didn't know, do we want them to speak after I intro Judge Scorsone, or do you want me to introduce the entire panel? I can introduce everyone all together.
However you'd like to do it.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep rolling. I'm just going to introduce you all, and then we'll go in the order that I introduced you guys. And this is a little bit out of order, but it's the first one I have up, and it is the bio of Langdon Worley. So Langdon is a Transylvania University 2007 graduate and the University of Kentucky College of Law 2010 graduate. She works at the firm of Sturgill, Turner, Barker, Moloney, PLLC here in Lexington. Her service areas are torts and insurance, government, and municipal law. Langdon serves currently as the Women's Lawyers Association current president. And Langdon's experience is in civil litigation, which has taken her to more than 60 counties within the state of Kentucky, where she has defended a wide variety of cases, ranging from motor vehicle accidents, premises liability matters to commercial trucking, products liability, fire loss, subrogation, and blasting cases. And Langdon, we're so glad that you're with us today as well. And finally, Our last presenter that we have today, or panelist, is Janine Tate-Webb. Janine Tate-Webb is a 2017 graduate of the University of Kentucky College of Law, and she's an attorney at Frost Brown Todd, LLC. Janine practices business litigation and frequently works on various commercial contract matters. Janine serves on the board of Greenhouse 17 and serves as an LCLD mentor and is deeply involved with her law firm's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Before moving to the United States to attend the university, Janine was raised and educated in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Janine, for being with us today. And what we plan to do today, and again, as Judge Scorsone stated to all of you attendees, if you have any questions of our panelists or Dr. Otis, if you would just throw those questions in our Q&A. But we're gonna have each one of our panelists take about 7 to 10, 7 to 9, 8 minutes or so to kind of give us their opening statements, and then we're gonna open it up for a question and answer. So Julie, I'm gonna let you go first out of the gate.
Thank you, Judge Murphy. Thank you, Judge Scorsone and Dr. Otis, Langdon, Janine, and everybody who's decided to participate in this webinar today. I know some of you who've signed up and some I haven't had the privilege of meeting yet, but I suspect that we're pretty much, you all are pretty much in the choir that we may be preaching to. In other words, you may already be woke, to use the current vernacular, and certainly have experienced yourselves discrimination and prejudice that some of the respondents in the survey admitted to. So first of all, we were, I guess, chosen to participate in this, or asked to participate in this, to share some of our personal experiences. And as you all have probably already seen, the women on the panel have already sort of nodded assent that we have been mistaken for court workers, court reporters, and it hasn't stopped in 30 years. When I first started practicing, I would walk into a courtroom for motion hour, and a bailiff or someone else would say, oh, you know, court reporter, you set up over there. So, and apparently it's still going on today. I think probably about 3 years ago, it happened to me again. I was assumed to be a court worker. Now that says a lot in and of itself. First of all, you know, women are at a certain level in our court system, as far as the workers versus the attorneys versus the judges and, you know, the people higher up in the administration and the running of our court systems. And I suspect that maybe some of the perceptions that were reflected in the survey may be because we have, in the last several years, got more women, certainly in Fayette County. At one point in time, Fayette County Circuit Court judges were all female. So we had, you know, lots of females. We have had, Fayette County has been kind of a leader in the state for having African-American judges, both male and female. So I don't know that the perceptions of some people are as accurate as the experiences that some of us have had. So speaking as a member of the LGBT or queer community, or whatever you want to call this particular categorization, you know, there's several isms. There's racism, there's sexism. Then we get to homophobia, we get to xenophobia, we get to transphobia. There's lots of problems in the human dynamic, and certainly our legal system is not immune to any of that. But I have to say that as a gay attorney, I have not personally experienced any kind of overt discrimination. But that's the problem. I mean, isn't it? Overt. You know, I think that's the experiences that people of color and women experience in general are not always overt. You know, you may have a feeling that you're not being treated in a certain way or equally as your counterparts of a different classification, but it's not overt. However, I have seen overt sayings about a person of sexual identity, or you know, what are they? I mean, what I've actually heard somebody say, point to somebody that they saw in the hallway of a courtroom and say, what is that? You know, is it a man? Is it a woman? What is that? I mean, it's like, so, you know, there's all different levels, but you know, as far as personally, I haven't actually experienced that sort of overt thing myself. However, it exists, okay? And I know this because Allison, Professor Connolly, and Professor Lawler a couple years ago did a diversity regional seminars for district bars. And they, you know, one of the places they went was Ashland, and Allison's from Ashland. I mean, you know, her family's from there. And, you know, they felt some feedback when they did this diversity seminar, but in the comments that they got afterward, Allison specifically was called a civil rights whore and a racial justice pimp. Now I'm like, how are you a whore and a pimp at the same time? But whatever. We're talking about lawyers who are attending the CLE in her hometown, and the response about this whole diversity seminar was to say something so juvenile like that. I mean, so yeah, and it's not just because it's Ashland, it's Eastern Kentucky. I reject those labels. I think that, frankly, in Central Kentucky and Louisville, we have this sort of, and since I'm originally a Northerner, I think, you know, my perspective, I can say this, we you know, Southerners are a little more polite. They're a little more genteel, you know. You know, the whole, and as far as LGBT people, you know, hate the sin, love the sinner. I mean, there's all kinds of justifications, and you know, people might actually loathe and despise who you are because of your race or your gender identity or your sexual orientation, but you know, butter couldn't melt in their mouth. I mean, they're just, you know, so there's that kind of cultural thing that prevents us from being able to understand the overt versus the sort of underlying and implicit bias. And I wonder, frankly, Dr. Otis, how many of those people in those trainings and things that you had mentioned had actually done the implicit bias training?
I'll just real quickly say, we didn't ask that question, but I have that as a sort of save for later notation. You just hit on the thing that as you're thinking forward about resolving problems, that is the problem. That implicit bias exists, and people are unaware of their biases. And so I think that when they responded to a lot of these questions, it wasn't a denial of their isms overtly, it was an unawareness of their isms that comes out. And so you hit the nail on the head there, Julie.
Okay, I thought that might be the case. Anyway, I wanted to mention about my clients. I have had clients specifically come to me because they know I'm gay or specifically come to me because I'm a woman. And I've had other clients who really don't care. It doesn't matter to them. And frankly, I think that my experience has been that my clients or potential clients have been a lot less biased maybe than the people in the legal profession. Because, you know, we've had frank conversations about, well, how do you feel about this jury? Or how do you feel about this judge? And, you know, they are more used to it. I mean, I think I have a lot of straight male clients who really, you know, could care less. So my experience with clients has been really, really good. I've been very fortunate in that respect. I guess the other thing is, you know, what do we do about all this? And I want to kind of leave with that. These are just some of the thoughts that came to my mind. You know, for trial attorneys, voir dire is really, really important. But how do you get people to express that they have these biases? Because, you know, you don't want them taking out on your client. You have to, and this is the weird part, is you have to make it okay. You have to make it okay for them to step up and do what they do on social media. You know, when they bully and they troll and do all those other things that this vast part of society now feels free to do, you've almost got to give them permission to do that and let their true selves come out if it's going to happen. Now, you know, I haven't had a trial for a couple years now, and I haven't tried that out, but it certainly is one possibility. And then I just wanted to dive into talking about what do we do about it. You know, watching the Democratic convention and watching Kamala Harris last night, she said one thing that was so fabulous that I thought was appropriate for this webinar, and that is, there's no vaccine for racism. We have to do the work. It's fabulous. And it's the same thing for sexism, for homophobia. There's no vaccine. We have to do the work.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate it. Those are powerful words. And I'm looking at the time, and I don't want to cut short Langdon or Janine, but we want to make sure we get to both of them before we open it up to question and answer. So Langdon, I'll let you go first, and then Janine, you'll wrap us up. And I see there's a couple questions already in the Q&A, so go ahead, Langdon, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Judge Murphy. Thank you for the introduction. I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying how thrilled and honored I am to be sitting at the table for this conversation. And I'm humbled by Judge Scorsone's asking me to be a part and to share some of my experiences and thoughts on the survey. As the current president of WLA and having been on the executive committee for WLA in some capacity for the past 5 years, I feel like I have a very unique access to kind of a finger on the heartbeat of our female attorney community and a valuable connection to those women. So rather than belaboring the numbers, because Dr. Otis has done a great job of explaining those to us, you know, the numbers don't lie. So regardless of how we may feel, the numbers tell us there is a disparity, and both men and women agree that women are being treated differently in some way in the office, in the courtroom, and in the practice of law in general. So the question is not whether it's happening, it's, to me, why it's happening, how it's being manifested, and what do we do to change it. And this isn't an indictment on just male attorneys, it's all of us, because in preparing for this today, I had to take a long, hard look at presumptions that I make, at reactions that I have, and figuring out why I do that and trying to stop. So in preparing for today, I spoke with a number of colleagues. I spoke with male attorneys, female attorneys, people at other firms, people at my firm, staff, and I'll start with the consensus that I came to because it's positive. And that consensus is we want to be better. The Fayette County Bar Association is collegial. We associate outside of work. We talk about work-life balance. That's evidenced by the fact that we're sitting here having this conversation. We've got 32 people on this call. So we want to have the talk. We're at the table. Our intention is good. So what's the problem? And I think the answer to that is our awareness. Our intention is good. Our awareness is off. And that is to say, you cannot fix a bias you don't know you have. It's the implicit bias that Julie talked about. If you asked all 32 attendees on this conference whether they respect their female counterparts, they would say absolutely, yes. So the problem isn't that we are being mean or hateful or doing something intentionally. It's that we have not identified and addressed our implicit bias. So I thought I would go through just a couple of examples, and this will be brief, from other attorneys I've spoken to that have either observed or experienced this behavior. Pet names, being called sweetie, honey, little lady, that kind of thing. Presuming that a female is going to prepare an order, even when it's not her own motion. I read literature discussing the fact that in an office setting, presuming that a female is going to do the clerical tasks such as note-taking, sending follow-up emails, that kind of thing. Talking over females in court during oral argument. And presuming that, for instance, a female is going to be the one to handle scheduling tasks, reach out and get dates from the mediator, that kind of thing. Now, and the last one I'll mention is how we talk about female attorneys who are aggressive, who are good female attorneys. They're aggressive on their case, and what does everyone say behind their back? I don't have to vocalize what they call them, but that's what we do. So I got an article from my good friend Katie Bouvier, because we always laugh about being called lady lawyer. And this article is called Miss, Are You an Attorney? And I'll close with this. In this article, she talks about those types of examples, being called little lady, that kind of thing, being presumed to the court reporter. And the quote is this: "These types of situations are not, in and of themselves, serious issues that affect the day-to-day practice of law. However, they are symptomatic of a larger problem when it comes to women in the practice of law. That is, despite gradual progress toward gender equality in the law, there is still much work to do. Women in the law still face challenges of being taken seriously in the courtroom, as well as when it comes to marketing on behalf of their firms. This leads to challenges in rising up the ladder to becoming the majority equity members or directors of their firms, which leads to the reported income disparity between male and female attorneys of 44%. So all that to say, we're doing the right thing by sitting at the table and having this conversation. Awareness is the first step that we can take toward making these numbers different when we do this diversity survey again in the future. Thank you all again for letting me speak today.
Thank you, Langdon. Janine, you ready? I'll let you wrap us up.
Well, I also want to say I am very happy to be here today, and a lot of the things I will say kind of will echo what Julie and Langdon have been saying, because, I mean, they really hit the nail on the head. The thing that came to mind when Dr. Otis was reading the findings was that there is this theme throughout the findings of the survey, and then also with everything that's going on now, whether that's to do with prejudice or COVID. It's really just, if it doesn't affect me personally, then it isn't real. And so that was just the thing that kept coming to mind when Dr. Otis was reading those findings. Another thing I did want to touch on is something very important that Julie said and that Langdon echoed as well, was to do with the covert discrimination. What we're seeing now, it's not, I think the reason that most people in that survey would say that they believe people are treated with respect, and they believe that race, sexual orientation, gender do not affect outcomes in the legal field, is because people are looking for direct examples of somebody being called the N-word, or somebody saying, I'm ruling this way because you are, this race or this sex or this sexual orientation. And we all know that that's not what discrimination looks like now. It's cloaked in just comments and things like that. And I've been in the legal profession for almost 3 years, which isn't a very long time. But unfortunately, I myself can tell stories about how my sex and my race have directly played into what somebody has said. But again, I call it diet racism or diet sexism, because it's one of those comments that sometimes you don't even realize is that bad until you repeat it out loud, or you're laying in bed and then you're like, wait a minute, someone actually said that to me. Because it takes me a moment. I mean, it really does. And people say all sorts of crazy things. So with that, I will kind of say that my experience is, obviously been in a law firm up until this point, which means that I don't have as much experience, inside a courtroom. So I do think that when I was listening to the survey results, I do wonder how my experience would be different to those who practice inside a courtroom all the time, because at my junior level, I really, have been in a court a few times. But one example does stick out to me. I had attended a hearing in chambers, and I was surrounded by men who were all over the age of 40 and who were all white, and we were all, it was an insurance case, so there were several parties, and then there was little old me. And when I was reading the executive summary yesterday about the survey, one of the things that were mentioned as a way that we could remedy some of this discrimination that goes on is to have more judges who are women, who are LGBTQ, who are, people of, women, judges of color. And I remember the judge in this case was a woman. And immediately, I could just tell that she read the room. She read the room. And I'm not saying that a man wouldn't have been able to read the room if it were all men in the room, but there was one particular gentleman who wouldn't let me speak, was speaking over me. And the judge, I don't think she'll ever know it. I think she just, was just doing what she did. But I knew that she knew the power dynamic in that room that day. Me being a junior attorney, me being a woman, maybe even me being a woman of color. And she immediately, would keep eye contact on me when when counsel was interrupting me. And so that was just an example of a moment that I felt like, wow, this is why it's really important to have representation. And again, I'm sure if I brought it up to this judge, she would have no idea that that's what she was doing, but I'm sure that both Langdon and Julie would have examples like that as well. And so I'll just kind of close it off with just talking about being in a law firm and being a woman of color. I mean, I am lucky enough to be at a law firm that recognizes that diversity is extremely important, and it's something that they really, champion behind. In doing that, that means we have to have tough conversations. It means we have to recognize that there's a problem with the numbers. And I think I read a survey recently that was actually, I can't remember, it wasn't obviously unique to Kentucky. It was an analysis of the legal field across the United States. And women, obviously, there's a higher rate of women who are leaving the legal profession in general, but women of color particularly, the numbers are really, really bad, and not just in law firms. This is everywhere. I mean, we've got women of color who leave the legal profession entirely. And in fact, I have women in my family who are lawyers who have done the same. So that's really scary. I mean, we're not just talking about a pay gap. We're not just talking about a gap in, promotions inside a law firm or wherever else. We're talking about leaving the legal profession entirely. And we need to address why that is. I mean, we need to address the dynamics that are within workplaces that create those gaps that make women, and particularly women of color, feel that they don't belong in those spaces. And I'll just kind of close off, kind of just hammering down on the point that one of the things that sticks out to me is that as we begin to continue having these discussions about diversity, you'll have a lot of people who will kind of scoff or turn their nose up at the fact that a lot of places are putting priority on hiring diverse talent. But we don't see that same reaction when somebody is hired for who they know, where they went to school, their wealth group. I mean, I could name a million people that I think are where they are because of their connections, especially in the Fayette County market. And so it's very interesting to me as we continue to have these conversations and we continue to look at jobs that will say, diversity matters to us. you do tick an extra box, but we're not hiring you just because of that. It's interesting to me how you have some people who will really think that you're only in your position because you tick a box, and they won't recognize the box that they tick themselves. So thank you.
That was very powerful. I just want to point out before we get to this one question that we have, Janine said something that reminds me as I was driving here, and actually I'm in Berea, Kentucky right now, but when I was driving on the road, I was thinking there's so many things that I've experienced being a Black woman in the legal profession that I have normalized, that was discrimination, that was bias, that were horrible statements. But I literally, as Janine said, you go back home and you don't respond. And many of you all know me. I have no qualms of speaking my mind. But I find myself, and I think many of us, we have just let it go. We have just let it roll off. And we've so much allowed these statements just to fester that people don't know. That's not okay to say. That's not okay to think that way. And so I do think that it not only has to, as Langdon said, it not only has to be a work in people challenging, but even for me, I have to be willing to challenge those places and speak truth when it's necessary. I will say this, Julie, you made a comment about the judiciary and being diverse, and I do believe Lexington does lead the way, but I have always pointed out the fact that there's only been 3 Black judges the entire time in Fayette County. And and that's Judge Payne, Judge Goodwine, and myself. And I just got here. So I am in Louisville is the only other place. And I think we have 2 judges that are in the outliers. There's no other minority judges in any other place in the Commonwealth. And district judges, I think there's 13 total African-American judges. And I think we have 1 new Hispanic judge in Jefferson County. Other than that, there's no diversity in the judiciary ranks. And I think there's many reasons why, but we can talk to that. But I think there is a Q&A, a question.
There is.
And do you want to take it? You want to take that, Judge Scorsone?
Sure.
Do you see
There's an attorney question, and it should go to Julie, which is basically that there are gay attorneys that are afraid to join the LGBT section, afraid of being identified as LGBT. Before you answer that, I wonder if very briefly Dr. Otis can address the fact this survey is about 2,000 lawyers and judges. Obviously, it's not the entire membership. How does it compare in terms of other statewide surveys in other states, and whether this is a sample that's big enough for us to be concerned about?
Sure. So what I'll say is, compared to other studies that have been done, statewide studies that have been done, and people are really inconsistent about doing them, the sheer number of respondents is one of the highest of any study that I've seen, including when the ABA does their studies around gender and race ethnicity. Their samples aren't any bigger than this. Ordinarily we talk about response rates, and I ballparked around 14% just based on a number of 13,000 and change that I'd identified at one point as the number of practicing attorneys in Kentucky. But the number's probably higher than that, because you have to deal with bad email addresses and a variety of things that make it hard to know how many people actually had the opportunity, even though it went out on the KBA listserv, to participate if they wanted to. All that said, it's not a representative sample, but it's a good size sample. When you look at the demographic profile, it looks like the state of Kentucky. I mean, the fact that there's a small percentage that identify as LGBTQ, well, that's true of the state. The fact that there's a small percentage that identify as people of color. We live in a predominantly white state. So it's not that far off. And so they're good numbers. What I would say to folks when they're looking at this and trying to decide, so what do we do with this? What I would say is, these are respectable numbers. And there is a thread that runs through them that says, this is information you want to pay attention to. It's telling you something. And the something that's telling you, I think, is quite useful. while you could garner better data with a random sample and things like that, there's really good information I think here because of the diversity of the sample. And I will say, you know, one of the other series of questions that we ask, and Janine's comments made me think about this a little bit too. There's a couple of things she said that I took notes on. One is that there are studies out there that show that a lot of LGBTQ folks leave the profession for the same reason. And therefore, when you go to do studies, and there aren't many studies at all, I mean, there's just not, of LGBTQ lawyers. Most anything you find has to do with folks who have ended up going to prison and then studying their experience, but not attorneys. So that same problem is there. And then the other thing is that we ask questions about whether or not people had heard either two separate series of questions inside the courtroom or in other settings where someone's gender, race, ethnicity, identity orientation, anything else was mentioned when it wasn't relevant to the case. And at a minimum, at least a third of the time, depending on what you were talking about, and it could be a lot more often in other cases, at least a third of the time people said, oh yeah, it was brought up when it wasn't relevant, which speaks to what Judge Murphy was saying, what you were saying, Janine. It's like if you bring something up like that and it's not relevant to the case, it's not that it doesn't impact the way people are thinking about what is being discussed. So it gets inserted and it has an impact even when it doesn't, it's not relevant to what we're talking about.
And I've seen the reversal of that. Knowing that I'm gay, I've had some attorneys when it comes to sentencing to let me know that the defendant's spouse or partner is of the same sex, as if that would somehow affect my final decision on sentencing. But with that, Ms. Butcher, would you address the question that we got?
Yeah, so I guess if the fear for someone joining the section of the bar, the LGBTQ section of the bar, is that they're going to out themselves, that's, you know, that's a constant concern for LGBTQ people. It's not like, you know, we wear our sexual orientation, if that's the category, you know, on our sleeve. You know, I don't have a big lavender L on my forehead. So, you know, if I out myself, what does that mean? You know, am I going to receive the kind of negative impact? And as Langdon had mentioned, am I not going to be able, and particularly in the law firm, to rise up, you know, through the levels and achieve the kind of status I want to within my firm? So, I mean, you know, I get that. And it's the age-old question that we've always faced. And I have to tell you, from a personal perspective, I have been in and out of the closet. Before, I mean, in theater, oh my gosh, you know, there's no question. I was happily waving my rainbow flag every chance I got. But when I became a lawyer at a law firm, that was not something that I felt comfortable doing. And we didn't have, of course, a section at that time. So it's a personal journey for people. And yeah, there's risk. There's definitely risk, particularly within a law firm. So you have to come to it on your own time.
Let me also say, I think it's an indictment that people still feel that way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it adds a little more pressure, I think, on those of us who are older or might be in a position of influence or senior partners or whatever. We need to be out. And only when lots of folks see that, you know, it's okay. You can be a judge, you can be a prosecutor, you know, you can be a senior partner in a law firm, be out, and it's okay. Then that will be a lot easier for some of the young folks to do that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And mentoring as well. And I'm talking about across every, you know, category, is mentoring of younger members of the bar who may identify with whatever category is really important for those of us who are older and, you know, have a little gray in the hair, or still, you know, I think it's important.
Yeah. So we have another question, and that question is, what are our next steps? And it's a great way to kind of wrap up. So Dana, I know we have a one stop, but if we could go a little bit over, what are our next steps to address all of the inequities noted in the study? And so I don't know whether, okay, thanks, Dana. I know that there were some key points that were listed inside of the study of things that people addressed, and I don't know if Dr. Otis wants to touch on those, and then if each one of our panelists want to go around and say their one thing. You all probably have many things, but since we are at our 1 o'clock hour, but if Dr. Otis, if you want to talk from the survey portion and.
Sure, I'll just quickly, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Judge Murphy. I'll just real quickly hit two things. One is, and somebody on the panel, maybe Janine mentioned this, that one of the suggestions that came out of it really had to do with the judicial system needs to look like the community that it serves. And I would argue that, and I think this does speak to part of what Janine was saying too, that we might even need to tip the scale slightly on that in a place that is as white and conservative as Kentucky, that we maybe don't want it to totally mirror the community because that's probably not going to get us where we need to go. But certainly part of what people were saying was the bench is very white male. The power brokers and firms are very white male. And that has an impact on the clients, that has an impact on junior attorneys. And so that needs to be addressed. And then the other thing that I'll say is what I mentioned earlier about people saying, I did this programming, I participated in this, and some of the folks that we really probably need to get the attention of, they said, well, it doesn't make any difference to me. And what I would say about that is, and I will say that they also said that pretty much across the board, they felt well prepared to work with a diversity of clients. I didn't know quite, that's a head scratcher, quite frankly. And so what I'll say is that when people sit down to try to figure out how to do programming and within the legal College of Law, the education system, to figure out what's the message that people need to hear that really opens the door on that implicit bias. If we all assume that everybody actually wants to do better, they don't realize, then what does it need to look like so that people don't say, yeah, I participated in that program, it didn't help me a bit.
So ladies, do you all have final statements as we wrap up?
My final thought, just as far as making a change, I think it starts at the firm. And I would be remiss not to mention Sturgill Turner, who has been incredibly supportive in trying to start identifying bias and how to address it. They're putting women in leadership positions. They've got a diversity and inclusion committee. They're working to make change. So I think the change starts at the firm level. We support our women attorneys in the toolkit that they need to go out and identify inappropriate behavior and stand up to that. So thank you all.
And next, I would just mirror what Langdon said. I'm very lucky to be at a firm that recognizes these issues on a personal level. I think we all just need to keep talking about it. Keep this energy up. Everything that's been going on, I know it gets tiring. I too sometimes want to, especially working from home, I too want to sometimes wake up and just forget that all this stuff is going on, and sometimes I have to take a breather, but we need to, after those breathers, keep up the energy. When you're standing around getting your coffee in the break room, whenever we all get to go back to the office, which is hopefully sooner rather than later, it's one thing, it's great to talk about sports, or you see this golf tournament this weekend, but then also follow up with, man, what do you think about everything that's going on? Talking to people who need to know that people are, that everything's going on, it's on their mind. I mean, even just me knowing, having a mentor in the firm and knowing that some people in the firm think about these things that are happening with all the, racial unrest and with all the unrest that's happening right now, I think it's really important for us to just keep this on the forefront and talk about it.
Ditto what everyone else said. And And whenever we see something that is overt on those rare occasions, call it out.
Yeah. There is one final question, Judge Scorsone, and it is how to encourage more widespread participation in implicit bias testing in order to capture those who believe mistakenly that they are immune to a form of bias. And I'm going to answer this only, and then I'll divert to Judge Scorsone and let him end us. But I think that every year we have mandatory ethics. I think we need to have mandatory implicit bias. Our profession means too much to our nation, to the way we do business. Our profession is what justice is about. So I don't understand why it can't be something that is required of every attorney. That's my opinion and that's my thought. And trust me, I've had those conversations with the Kentucky Bar, and hopefully.
Absolutely. And until we get there, I can tell you that Judge Murphy and I have been working to get an implicit bias program for our local judges and to hopefully get that organized so it's every year.
Yeah.
And until we have an requirement, I think it'd be great for the local bar association to initiate discussions with all the firms and to try to encourage them to develop and bias programs. So until mandatory, let's move voluntarily towards that.
Yes.
So on that point, I think we are past our time. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Otis. Thank you so much, Ms. Butcher, Worley, Ms. Webb. There we got it's been a great discussion. Thank you all for chiming in, and I hope this is the first of many other discussions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. It was wonderful. We will send out the CLE code in an email after this with a short survey and also a link to our YouTube channel. And this should be posted on there this afternoon. So if you have any questions, attendees or panelists, feel free to contact me either through email or you can give our office a call, whatever you need, guys.
Thank you so much for setting
Thank
it
you,
up.
Dana.
Thanks, Dana.
Dana.
As always.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
guys.
Bye.